The outer edge of Dustfall Market was no place for kindness. It was a stretch of cracked stone alleys, flickering lanterns, and the lingering scent of smoke and spice where merchants haggled hard. Guards looked the other way, and the desperate learned quickly that survival came before everything else. By the time night settled over the market, most stalls had closed, leaving behind scraps, shadows, and the quiet rustle of those who scavenged what little remained. Among them walked a human named Caleb Dorn, a man who had long ago learned how to live on almost nothing, carrying with him a worn satchel filled with tools, spare parts, and just enough food to last another day. He wasn't a hero, nor was he anyone important, just another face in a place where no one remembered names. But he had a habit that set him apart in small, unnoticed ways. He never wasted food, and he never ignored someone who asked politely. That night, the cold crept in early, seeping between the stones and settling into the bones of anyone caught outside. Caleb had managed to trade for a small portion of cooked meat and flatbread, barely enough for himself, but it was more than he'd had the night before. He found a quiet corner near a broken fountain, its water long dried up, and sat down with his back against the worn stone. The market was nearly empty now, the distant sounds of late traders fading into the background. For a moment, everything felt still. He unwrapped his food slowly, the warmth already fading from it, and took a small bite, chewing thoughtfully as he stared into the dimly lit alley ahead. That was when he heard it. A whisper so soft he almost thought it was the wind. "May we have your leftovers?" Caleb froze mid-bite, his eyes narrowing slightly as he glanced around. The voice hadn't come from behind him or from the open market. It had come from the alley ahead, where the shadows pooled thick and deep between the crumbling walls. He didn't respond immediately, his instincts sharpening. In Dustfall, voices in the dark were rarely harmless. "Depends," he said after a moment, his tone calm but cautious. "Who's asking?" There was a pause. Then movement, small, hesitant. For shapes shifted within the shadows, barely visible at first, then slowly stepping into the faint light of the nearby lantern. Caleb's breath caught slightly as he realized what he was looking at. Dragon cubs. Not one. For they were small, smaller than he expected, each no larger than a medium-sized dog, but their condition made them look even smaller. Their scales, once likely vibrant, were dull and uneven, some chipped or faded. Their bodies thin in a way that spoke of prolonged hunger. Their wings were folded tightly against them, not in rest, but in discomfort, as if they didn't have the strength to hold them properly. And their eyes were what held him. All four pairs were fixed on him with a mixture of caution and quiet desperation, but one stood out among them, a cub with deep, luminous blue eyes that seemed far too aware, far too steady for its size. It was the one who had spoken. "We won't take much," the blue-eyed cub added softly, its voice barely above a whisper. "Just what you don't need." Caleb stared at them for a long moment, his mind racing. Dragon cubs didn't belong here. Not in Dustfall. Not alone. They were rare, valuable, dangerous to possess, even more dangerous to be caught with. Whoever these cubs belonged to, or had belonged to, was nowhere in sight. And yet, there they were, standing in front of him, asking, not demanding, not threatening, asking for scraps. He looked down at the food in his hands. It wasn't much, barely enough to keep him going until morning. If he gave it away, the blue-eyed cub shifted slightly, as if sensing his hesitation, but it didn't step forward. It didn't beg. It simply waited, its gaze steady, respectful in a way that felt out of place in a market like this. The other three cubs stayed close behind it, glancing between Caleb and the food, their hunger obvious but restrained. Caleb exhaled slowly. "You've got manners," he muttered, almost to himself. Then, without another word, he broke the flatbread in half. He tossed one piece gently toward them. All four cubs flinched at the movement, instinctively stepping back, but the blue-eyed one held its ground. It watched the piece land, then looked back at Caleb as if confirming permission. Caleb gave a small nod. "Go on," he said simply. That was all it took. The cub stepped forward, cautiously at first, then picked up the bread in its small jaws and turned back toward the others. Instead of eating it immediately, it placed the piece down and nudged it toward the smallest of the group. The other cub hesitated, then began to eat, slowly at first, then with growing urgency. Caleb watched in silence, something tightening in his chest. He didn't hesitate the second time. The rest of the bread followed, then the meat. This time, the cubs didn't wait as long, though they still didn't rush him. The blue-eyed one divided the food again, ensuring each of the others had something before taking any for itself. Caleb leaned back slightly, his now empty hands resting on his knees as he observed them. "You're leading them," he said quietly, more statement than question. The blue-eyed cub looked up at him, a small piece of food still in its mouth, and for a brief moment, their eyes met again. There was no fear there now, only a quiet acknowledgement. "Where's your mother?" Caleb asked after a moment. The question changed everything. The cubs froze. The smallest one stopped eating entirely, its head lowering slightly. Another shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the alley behind them. But it was the blue-eyed cub that answered, its voice even softer than before. "Gone." The word was simple, final. Caleb didn't press further. He didn't need to. The silence that followed carried more weight than any explanation could. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly as he leaned his head back against the cold stone of the fountain. "Figures," he muttered. "Nothing's ever simple." The cubs finished the food quickly after that, though not greedily. When they were done, they didn't run. They didn't retreat back into the shadows. Instead, they remained where they were, watching him. Waiting. For what? Caleb asked, raising an eyebrow slightly. "You got what you asked for." The blue-eyed cub took a small step forward. "We don't have anywhere else to go," it said quietly. Caleb closed his eyes for a brief moment. Of course they didn't. He let out a long breath, then opened his eyes again, looking at the 4 small, starving dragon cubs standing in front of him in the middle of a forgotten market that offered no mercy to anyone. "This is a bad idea," he said under his breath. Then he pushed himself to his feet. "Come on," he added, jerking his head slightly toward the alley behind him. "You're not sleeping out here tonight." The cubs didn't move at first, as if unsure they had heard him correctly. Then the blue-eyed one stepped forward, and the others followed. Dragon. The alleys of Dustfall Market twisted like a maze built to lose people, not guide them, and as Caleb Dorn walked deeper into the dim, narrow paths beyond the main square, the faint sound of small claws tapping against stone followed close behind him. Footsteps, uneven and cautious, yet determined not to fall behind. He didn't look back often, but he didn't need to. He could feel them there, keeping pace despite their exhaustion, their hunger only barely eased by the scraps he had given them. The cold pressed in from every direction now that the market's lights were behind them, and the shadows seemed thicker, more watchful. Caleb finally slowed near a rusted metal door set into the side of a crumbling building, half hidden behind stacked crates and broken panels. It wasn't much, just a forgotten storage space he'd claimed months ago after patching the leaks and reinforcing the lock. But it was dry, hidden, and most importantly, his. He crouched slightly, shifting the debris aside before pulling the door open with a low creak, then stepped inside and gestured with a small tilt of his head. "In," he said quietly. The cubs hesitated at the entrance, their instincts clearly warring with their need for shelter. The smallest one lingered behind the others, its body low, its eyes darting between the dark interior and the human standing just inside it. But the blue-eyed cub stepped forward first, as it had before, its gaze flicking briefly to Caleb before crossing the threshold. It paused just inside, taking in the space, the worn blankets piled in one corner, the dim lantern hanging from a hook, the faint warmth trapped within the enclosed walls. Then, slowly, it moved further in, and that was all the encouragement the others needed. One by one, they followed until all 4 were inside. Caleb closed the door behind them, sealing out the cold night, and lit the lantern properly, casting a soft, steady glow across the small room. Up close, their condition was even more obvious. The cubs' movements were sluggish, their limbs unsteady from weakness, their wings twitching occasionally as though cramped or sore. One had a small cut along its side, another a torn edge along one wing membrane. The smallest one, barely larger than a cat, looked as though it had struggled the most, its breathing slightly uneven even at rest. Caleb frowned, kneeling down and setting his satchel aside. "All right, let's take a look at you lot," he muttered. The cubs stiffened slightly as he approached, but none of them retreated. The blue-eyed one remained closest, watching his every move with quiet intensity, as if deciding whether to trust him further. Caleb moved slowly, deliberately, reaching into his satchel and pulling out a small container of clean water and a strip of cloth. He dipped the cloth and held it out, not forcing contact. "This might sting a bit," he said, though he knew they didn't understand the words. The cub with the cut along its side flinched when he touched it, a soft hiss escaping its throat, but Caleb didn't pull away. He worked gently, cleaning the wound with careful precision. His movements practiced from years of fixing both machines and the occasional injured stray that wandered too close to his space. "Easy, you'll live," he murmured under his breath. The cub gradually relaxed, the tension leaving its body as the immediate pain faded into something manageable. One by one he checked them: the torn wing, the bruised limb, the small signs of neglect and hardship that told a story he didn't need words to understand. They hadn't just been hungry, they'd been surviving, barely. When he reached the smallest one, he paused. It didn't pull away, but it didn't lean in either, its tiny body rigid as he gently placed a hand against its side. He could feel its heartbeat. Fast. Too fast. "You're the worst off, aren't you?" he said quietly. The little cub blinked slowly, its eyes dimmer than the others, but it didn't resist as he wrapped it lightly in a piece of cloth for warmth. He adjusted the blankets on the floor, creating a small nest-like space, then gestured lightly. "There. Rest." The cubs looked at him, then at the space. For a moment, none of them moved. Then the blue-eyed one stepped forward again, curling itself into the blankets. After a second, the others followed, settling in close together, their bodies instinctively pressing side by side for warmth. The smallest one ended up in the center, tucked safely between the others. Caleb leaned back against the wall, letting out a slow breath. "You're lucky I'm soft," he muttered, though there was no real complaint in his voice. He reached into his satchel again, pulling out a small, hidden portion of dried food he had been saving, his backup for emergencies. He stared at it for a moment, then sighed and set it down near the cubs. "Here, last of it. Don't expect more till I figure something out." The blue-eyed cub lifted its head, sniffing cautiously, then nudged the food toward the others again, repeating the same quiet leadership it had shown before. Caleb watched that, something thoughtful crossing his expression. "You keep doing that," he said, "making sure they eat first." The cub glanced at him briefly, then looked away, as if the answer was obvious. Time passed quietly after that. The storm outside had dulled into a distant wind, no longer howling, no longer violent. Inside the small shelter, the warmth slowly built, the lantern casting a steady glow as the cubs finally began to relax. One by one, their eyes closed, their breathing evening out into something resembling real rest. Even the smallest one, though still fragile, seemed calmer, its body no longer trembling. Caleb stayed awake. He watched them, his mind turning over everything that had happened. For dragon cubs, alone, starving, in Dustfall, that wasn't just unusual, it was dangerous. Dragons didn't just disappear, especially not mothers with young. Something had happened, something bad enough to leave these four on their own. He rubbed his face with one hand, exhaling slowly. "This is gonna bring trouble," he said under his breath. "I just know it." As if the world itself wanted to prove him right, a distant sound echoed through the alley outside. Faint, but unmistakable. Footsteps. Not one set. Multiple. Caleb's head lifted instantly, his body going still. The cubs stirred slightly at the shift in the air, the blue-eyed one's eyes opening halfway, alert despite its exhaustion. Voices followed. Low. Searching. "Tracks end around here." Small, 4 of them. Caleb's jaw tightened. He moved quietly, standing without making a sound, his gaze shifting to the door. Whoever was out there, they weren't just passing through. They were looking, and somehow, they were looking for the cubs. Dragon. The moment the voices reached the door, the fragile sense of safety inside Caleb Dorn's shelter shattered like thin glass under pressure, and every instinct he had screamed the same warning. They're too close. He didn't move immediately, not in panic, but in calculation. Years in Dustfall Market had taught him that sudden actions got you noticed, and being noticed in a place like this was often the last mistake you made. Instead, he slowly crouched near the lantern and turned the flame down until the room dimmed into a dull amber glow, shadows stretching long and uneven across the walls. Behind him, the dragon cubs had already reacted. The blue-eyed one was fully awake now, its body low and tense, while the others stirred with soft, anxious sounds, pressing closer together. Even the smallest cub, weak as it was, lifted its head slightly, sensing the danger in the air. Caleb glanced back at them, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not a sound," he murmured, though he knew they understood more from tone than words. Outside, the footsteps stopped. A hand brushed against the metal door, lightly at first testing. Then came the voice again, clearer now, edged with impatience. "Door's been used recently." Another voice, lower, colder, replied, "Open it." Caleb's jaw tightened. There was no time left. He moved quickly but quietly, crossing the small room in 2 steps and pulling a loose panel from the wall behind the stacked crates. It revealed a narrow crawl space, barely large enough for the cubs, impossible for a grown man to fit through comfortably. He gestured sharply. "In. Now." The cubs hesitated for half a second, fear, confusion, but the blue-eyed one moved first, just as it always did. It darted toward the opening, then paused just long enough to nudge the smallest cub forward before slipping inside. The others followed in quick succession, their bodies squeezing through the tight space. The smallest one struggled slightly, letting out the faintest whimper, but Caleb gently guided it through, his movements firm but careful. "Go," he whispered. "Stay quiet." The moment the last tail disappeared into the darkness, Caleb shoved the panel back into place and dragged a crate in front of it just as the door burst open. Cold air flooded the room, along with 3 figures wrapped in dark cloaks, their boots heavy against the stone floor. They didn't hesitate. They spread out immediately, their eyes scanning every corner with trained precision. One of them carried a long, hooked staff, its metal tip faintly glowing with a dull red light. Another held a small device that emitted a soft, rhythmic pulse. Hunters. Caleb straightened slowly, turning to face them with a neutral expression. "Bit late for visitors," he said, his tone flat, unimpressed. The man with the staff stepped forward, his gaze sharp beneath the shadow of his hood. "We're looking for something," he said. "For some things, actually. Small. Valuable." Caleb shrugged slightly, leaning one shoulder against the wall as if he had nothing to hide. "You just described half the market." The second hunter moved closer to the blankets, nudging them with his boot. "Warm," he muttered. "Someone's been here." "Yeah," Caleb replied dryly. "Me." The third hunter raised the pulsing device, sweeping it slowly across the room. The soft glow flickered, then steadied, the rhythm quickening slightly. Caleb's eyes flicked to it for just a fraction of a second before returning to the man in front of him. "Funny thing," the man with the staff said, his voice lowering. "We've been tracking a very specific signature. Something rare. Something that doesn't belong in a place like this." He took another step closer. "And it led us right here." Caleb didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch just enough to be uncomfortable, then exhaled through his nose. "Then your tracker's broken." The device pulsed faster. The third hunter frowned, adjusting something on its side. "No," he said quietly. "It's not." For a split second, the room held its breath. Then the smallest of sounds betrayed everything. A faint, muffled chirp from behind the wall. Caleb felt it like a blade sliding between his ribs. The hunters heard it too. All three heads snapped toward the crates. The man with the staff smiled slowly, the expression cold and satisfied. There it is. He moved instantly, shoving the crate aside with a single, forceful motion. The panel behind it cracked slightly under the impact, revealing the edge of the hidden space. Caleb moved just as fast. He stepped forward, grabbing the man's arm before he could strike the panel. His grip firm despite the size difference. "You don't want to do that," Caleb said, his voice no longer flat, but steady, dangerous in a quiet, controlled way. The hunter looked down at his hand, then back at Caleb, amusement flickering in his eyes. "And you're going to stop me?" Caleb didn't answer. He just tightened his grip. For a brief moment it looked almost absurd. A lone human standing against three trained hunters, but something in his posture, in the way he didn't flinch, didn't back down, made the moment stretch longer than it should have. Then the second hunter moved, swinging the butt of his weapon toward Caleb's side. Caleb saw it coming. He twisted, taking the hit along his arm instead of his ribs, the impact sending a sharp jolt of pain through him, but he didn't let go. Instead, he shoved forward, forcing the first hunter back a step. "They're not yours," Caleb said, his voice low, controlled despite the pain. "They're not yours either," the hunter snapped back, wrenching his arm free. "And they're worth more than you'll see in a lifetime." The third hunter raised the device again, its glow now bright, almost eager. "Enough," he said. "Move him." The second hunter stepped forward again, this time faster, more precise. Caleb knew he couldn't take all three, not for long, not in a straight fight, but he didn't need to win. He just needed to buy time. For what, he wasn't entirely sure. But something in his chest told him it mattered. He shifted his stance slightly, positioning himself between them and the wall. "You'll have to go through me," he said. The words hung in the air, simple and absolute. Behind the wall, the cubs were silent now, completely still. Even the smallest one had stopped making noise. The blue-eyed cub, pressed in the darkness with the others, didn't understand everything that was happening, but it understood enough. It understood danger. It understood that the human outside was standing between them and it. And something else stirred in its chest, something deeper than fear, something ancient. The hunters advanced. And for the first time since they had entered, Caleb smiled, just slightly. Because far above Dustfall Market, hidden beyond the clouds, something had begun to move. Dragon. The first strike came fast, but not fast enough. Caleb Dorn twisted his body just as the second hunter lunged, the weapon grazing his side instead of crushing his ribs, and he used the momentum to shove forward, forcing space between them again. His breath sharp but controlled despite the pain that flared through him. He knew he couldn't win this. Not in strength, not in numbers, but winning had never been the point. All he needed was time. Just a little more time. The hunters regrouped almost instantly, their movements coordinated, practiced, and efficient in a way that made it clear they had done this many times before. "Last chance," the one with the staff said, his tone losing patience, the faint red glow at its tip intensifying as he raised it slightly. "Step aside." Caleb didn't move, didn't even consider it. Instead, he shifted his weight, planting himself firmly between them and the hidden panel, his voice steady despite the situation tightening around him like a vice. "Not happening." The third hunter didn't wait for another exchange. He lunged forward, faster than before, aiming to bypass Caleb entirely and reach the wall. But Caleb anticipated it, intercepting him with a sharp step and a hard shove that sent both of them crashing into the side of the room. Pain flared through his shoulder as it struck stone, but he held on, grappling just long enough to disrupt the motion. Behind them, the second hunter moved again, striking with precision, and this time the blow connected solidly, sending Caleb staggering back a step, his breath leaving him in a harsh exhale. The room felt smaller now, tighter, the air thick with tension and the faint metallic scent of danger. The staff-wielding hunter stepped forward once more, raising his weapon, the glow at its tip now pulsing like a heartbeat. "Enough," he said coldly. Then the world changed. Started as a sound deep, distant, and impossibly vast. A low, resonant rumble that didn't belong to the narrow alleys of Dustfall Market, didn't belong to the small, broken room they stood in. It rolled through the ground beneath their feet, subtle at first, then growing, building into something that made the very walls tremble. The hunters froze. Caleb did too, though not out of fear, out of recognition of something he didn't fully understand, but felt all the same. The rumble became a roar, not just loud, ancient, the kind of sound that didn't just reach your ears, but sank into your bones, into your chest, into the deepest part of your instincts and told you, without question, that something far beyond you had arrived. The lantern flickered violently as the air shifted. Dust fell from the ceiling in soft streams. And then silence. A single heartbeat of stillness. Then the roof above them exploded inward. Stone shattered. Wood splintered. The entire structure groaned under the force as something massive descended through it, not crashing wildly, but landing with controlled, overwhelming power that filled the space with wind, debris, and a presence so immense it stole the breath from every living thing inside. The hunters were thrown back by the shockwave, their footing lost as they scrambled to regain control. Caleb stumbled, catching himself against the wall, his eyes lifting, slowly, almost disbelievingly, to what now occupied the center of the room. A dragon. Not a cub. Not small. Not weak. This was something else entirely. Its scales shimmered in deep shades of blue and silver, catching the faint light in a way that made them seem almost alive, shifting like a storm captured in motion. Its wings, partially folded in the confined space, still stretched wide enough to brush against the broken walls, and its eyes, those eyes, burned with a piercing, icy intensity that locked onto the hunters with immediate, undeniable focus. For a moment no one moved. Then the smallest sound broke the silence. A soft, familiar chirp. From behind the wall, the dragon's gaze flicked instantly to the source. The panel cracked, then burst outward as the 4 cubs tumbled free, no longer hiding, no longer silent. They rushed forward without hesitation, their earlier fear replaced by something stronger, recognition, relief. The smallest one stumbled, barely keeping its footing, but it didn't stop. The blue-eyed cub reached the dragon first, letting out a sharp, almost desperate cry as it pressed against the massive limb. The dragon lowered its head immediately, its posture shifting from overwhelming dominance to something protective, almost gentle as it nudged each cub in turn, confirming what it already knew. They were alive. They were safe. Then it lifted its head again and looked at the hunters. There was no hesitation this time, no warning. The temperature in the room dropped instantly as the dragon exhaled, a wave of frost-like energy surging forward, freezing the ground at the hunters' feet, creeping up their legs before they could react. One tried to move too late. Ice locked him in place. Another raised his weapon, panic breaking through his training. But the dragon's gaze alone was enough to stop him, the sheer force of it pressing him back without a single physical strike. "Why, you don't understand." One of them stammered, his voice shaking now, all confidence gone. The dragon let out a low growl. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The sound carried a promise older than words, a warning that did not need repeating. The hunters didn't try again. They couldn't. Within moments, they were retreating, those who could still move scrambling for the broken exit, abandoning their mission entirely, their fear outweighing whatever reward they had come for. The one frozen to the ground struggled briefly, then stilled as the dragon's gaze lingered on him, unblinking. Silence returned, but it was no longer empty. It was full of presence, of power, of something that had shifted the balance of everything in that small, broken space. The dragon turned its attention then, slowly, to Caleb. For a moment, neither moved. Caleb stood where he was, breathing steady despite the chaos that had just unfolded. His eyes meeting the creature's without flinching. He should have been afraid. Anyone else would have been. But all he felt was the same quiet certainty that had guided him from the beginning. "They just needed food," he said simply. The dragon studied him, really studied him. Then its gaze shifted briefly to the cubs. All 4 now gathered close, the blue-eyed one standing slightly forward, its eyes fixed on Caleb. It let out a soft, low sound. Not a roar, not a growl, but something quieter, something acknowledging. Then, in a movement so deliberate it carried unmistakable meaning, the dragon lowered its massive head, just slightly. Not submission, recognition. Caleb exhaled slowly, a faint, almost tired smile touching his face. "Yeah," he murmured. "Guess that makes us even." The smallest cub broke away from the group then, padding weakly but determinately toward him. It reached his side and pressed lightly against his leg, letting out a soft chirp that felt different now. Not desperate, not afraid, just warm. Caleb hesitated for a second, then rested his hand gently on its head. "You're gonna be all right," he said quietly. The dragon watched that moment, and somewhere in the depths of its ancient gaze, something shifted. Because in a world where most turned away, one human had stepped forward. "Dragon,"